Abraham gets the promise of progeny that looks like it's never going to be fulfilled because his wife is infertile. But he is then promised repeatedly in Genesis 17 and 18 that in fact, despite what looks to be the case, Sarah will in fact have children. And she does. She has two of them, Ishmael and Isaac. But Ishmael is relatively quickly shuffled off the scene, isn't he?
He is, but now there's a little bit of interest there beforehand because it isn't actually Sarah who has Ishmael, right? So this is our biblical precedent for surrogacy.
It is.
That he gets, that Sarah, being magnanimous about this, says, take my handmaid. And then when he does, then she doesn't like it so well.
Right.
So there can be problems with it. We have two stories. Here again, we have a J one, I guess, and an E one. And in the first one, she's shuttled off the scene because she looks down on Sarah at first, and Sarah says, please get rid of her. Abraham is consistently a wimp when it comes to doing what Sarah wants.
This is true.
And doesn't really seem to be too concerned. He may make some expressions of regret about what's happening to poor old Hagar. So first time she's sent out, then she's brought back again. Later on in the E version of the story, she'll be sent out later on when Sarah doesn't want her son playing with Isaac. And this time she goes out and she's left out in the wilderness, you would think in a fairly perilous state. But the Lord blesses her anyway, and so it's all okay.
Right. And this is, I think, undoubtedly an etiology for the existence of the Ishmaelite tribes who occupy that wilderness space, specifically the one between Canaan and Egypt, which is where that story takes place. Once Ishmael is off the scene, there's Isaac, who is, in many ways, a blank slate, a non-character. I mean, Isaac has very little personality of his own. If you look at it just simply in terms of amount of material, there's quite a bit on Abraham, quite a bit on Jacob, a couple of chapters about Isaac.
I think he's kind of like the middle child.
He gets overlooked.
Yes.
Overlooked by
the eldest and the youngest get all the attention.
This is why I only have two.
Yeah.
But the story that Isaac is most famous for is a story in which he is as passive as any character ever is in the Bible.
Yes.
Right? The sacrifice of Isaac, so it's called, in Genesis 22, in Hebrew known as the Akedah, the binding of Isaac.
And he is so passive in it that later tradition bends over backwards to make it seem like he was actually an active partner in this. But that does not show up in the Bible here.
Yeah, and part of the problem is that we can't quite tell what age we're supposed to be picturing Isaac as, because the various sources have gotten us to different points in his life. So there is a tradition that holds that Isaac was a young boy or a teenager. Chronologically, if you read it right on point, he's 47, which I don't think is how most of us envision the story happening.
True. He has to be old enough to carry some firewood.
Right.
He's old enough at some point to figure out what's happening and to ask a question about it. But, you know, he was an only child. He may have matured late. Who knows? Okay.
Now, it's introduced by the narrator as a test.
Yes.
God is going to test Abraham. Is Abraham aware of what's happening here?
No, I think it's absolutely crucial to the story that Abraham does not know it's a test. And I've seen people do this because it's a story that bothers people, but some people then say, oh, it was a test, and Abraham knew this all along. This would take the whole point out of the story, because it is really a test of Abraham, and it's only a serious test if he understands that he may have to follow through on it.
Right.
Now, and that means be willing to sacrifice his son.
Now, are we to imagine then that Abraham's God is authentically asking for child sacrifice? Or what's the relationship with the practice of sacrifice here, child sacrifice? Is it a story that condemns it? Is it a story that condones it? You can see going both ways with it.
First of all, let's talk a little bit about child sacrifice and its role. Now, we know that various people practice child sacrifice. That's beyond any serious doubt. Now, was it practiced in Israel and Judah? Well, apparently so.
There are prophetic condemnations of it.
Yes, and you don't condemn things that nobody was doing.
Right.
Now, but it's not only prophetic condemnations of it. You have stories about King Ahaz and King Manasseh making their sons pass through fire. That's usually taken to mean sacrifice them by burning. We know of, at least there is a story told of a king of Moab who in a time of crisis in a war sacrificed his son, and it worked.
And it worked.
And it turned around the battle. And, you know, we know the story of Agamemnon. We have the story of Jephthah, who makes a vow to the Lord, if you let me win this battle, I'll sacrifice to you the first one that comes out of my house. And it turns out to be his daughter, which is not what he intended.
But God doesn't stop it.
But God doesn't stop it, exactly.
Yeah.
Now, we have the case in the prophet Micah of the hypothetical person praying to the Lord, Lord, you know, with what should I come before you?
Right.
Should I sacrifice my firstborn for the sin of my soul? Again, this would not make any sense if people weren't doing it. There was a Tophet, or a place, as the late Morton Smith used to say, for burning babies outside of Jerusalem that was only destroyed by King Josiah. Jeremiah is still thundering against it. That's now at the time of the Babylonian exile.
And depending on when you want to date parts of Leviticus too, there's explicit condemnation of it in Leviticus also. And many people want to put that quite late.
And in Deuteronomy. And then you have Ezekiel at the time of the exile saying that I gave them commandments that were not good to horrify them by the offering up of their firstborn. Now there is in fact a commandment in the book of Exodus that could be read that way, maybe doesn't have to be, but it's the firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. And then later on in Exodus it's clarified that you substitute for that.
Right.
But you know, you could say it was on the books, it could be read that way.
In other words,
Ezekiel seems to be suggesting that this was...
We're not necessarily reading child sacrifice as an issue back into this story.
That's right.
But even so, if we admit that child sacrifice was a present concept in ancient Israel, when God says sacrifice Isaac and then pulls back and then says no, don't, is that essentially another condemnation of the practice?
Well, it doesn't sound to me like a condemnation of the practice because he praises Abraham for doing it. He says, now I know that you fear God. So he doesn't want him to carry through with it in this particular case.
And why not?
Well, after all, you know, it was hard enough to get one child out of Sarah when she was, 99 or something?
That's right.
You wouldn't want to go through this again.
That's right.
But there isn't any condemnation. He does not say to Abraham, you should have known better than to try to do this, which I think is what modern critics would tend to say, and I think with some reason. But that's not what God says. God says, you know, I like your willingness to do this. It's all right this time now that I know you're willing to do it.
Do you have this suspicion that this is the kind of story that might play a part in a certain sort of fundamentalist thinking about doing whatever it takes, or not questioning, right, a lack of critical engagement with what seems to be the divine word? There's something problematic about, for our perspective, about Abraham's utter willingness to do what seems such a horrifying thing.
You know, and the issue here is not whether Abraham was right to do this in his context, because we are all creatures of our context to some degree. But the problem arises when people read this as scripture and tend to look at it as examples to be imitated. This isn't the only text in Genesis that would be highly problematic. We've had stories about Abraham passing off his wife as his sister. generally not recommended to try this at home, but this one may be more problematic than most. There was a case in the state of California sometime in the 90s where a man who had converted to a very conservative Protestant sect got it into his head that God wanted him to sacrifice his daughter, and by all accounts, he did love his daughter. Now, he doesn't say that he wanted to do like Abraham, but it's hard to imagine that that wasn't at work somewhere or that there wasn't some connection. He was put on trial and acquitted by reason of insanity. That would be the modern perspective on it. I mean, there was no other indication that the man was insane. But it is a dangerous text that way. Famous critique of this by Immanuel Kant, the great Enlightenment philosopher, who said that in effect that Abraham should have known better, that if somebody tells you to sacrifice your child, you should know, I know that's wrong. Whether this voice that I hear from heaven is really God, that's another question. And that poses the question with a lot of this material of the epistemology of revelation, of how you know that.
Right.
This, of course, is a modern perspective, but as I say, the issue isn't how we judge Abraham in his time.
Right.
The issue is what the implications of the story should be nowadays.
There's an interesting parallel in text in Deuteronomy about prophets, right? If a prophet comes to you and tells you to do something that doesn't sound right, you know he's a false prophet. Right?
Yeah.
Well, what happens when there's no intermediary? Right? It's far easier for us to condemn those who follow than I think those who think that they are hearing directly from.
Now, you know, in this case of the story of Abraham, people did see problems with it in antiquity. You don't have to wait for the Enlightenment. And you can see that they saw problems by the attempts they make to get around it. And there's a lot of references, beginning with the Book of Jubilees in the 2nd century BC, some stuff in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and then it comes up big in the Targums, the Aramaic translations of the Bible. And the thrust of all of that is to say, but Isaac consented. And this is why the binding of Isaac becomes voluntary self-sacrifice. Whether at some point this is influenced by Christianity, the suspicion arises.
This is a story that has a substantial afterlife and reuse in Christianity.
It sure does. And of course, some of the same issues come up in Christianity of, do we think of the death of Jesus as human sacrifice? But one reading of it is God gave his beloved Son. And so there is a really troubling question there about what satisfies God. Now, at the same time, I think that's what gives all of these stories their power. Lots of people believe in a hungry God, a God who has to be satisfied and requires blood, whether of animals or of human beings. That's some of the primitive roots of religion, I think, and it's something we haven't fully come to grips with.
I have to say, I think it's also the case that there are very few stories, particularly in Genesis, that are morally unambiguous.
Yeah.
One of the reasons I think these stories work and have lasted to the point where they were included in this text was there's what to talk about with these stories.
That's right.
This is not none of these are simple morality tales. Right? They're complicated, and that's what, as you say, gives them power and makes them interesting and has made them interesting forever. It's not a modern thing to be intrigued. So after the sacrifice of Isaac, he's had his big moment. He will not see his father again until the day his father dies, when he buries him. He will never see his mother again, who dies in the next chapter.
And you might say, would he have wanted to?
Probably not. I think they went their separate ways after this. His father does get a wife for him without the two of them ever seeing each other. But that's about as much as happens to Isaac. He passes from the scene within a couple of chapters, and he won't really come to prominence again until his son Jacob uses him as an object of trickery.
Yeah.
And that's what we are up to talk about next.
And for moral ambiguity, you're not going to get better than Jacob.